भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद का उदय। भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद का इतिहास लेखन। भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद के अधिकांश इतिहासकारों का तर्क है कि आधुनिक अर्थ में भारतीय राजनीतिक राष्ट्र ब्रिटिश राष्ट्र की स्थापना से पहले मौजूद नहीं था। ऐसा कोई राष्ट्र आत्मचेतना रूप में भारतीय सभ्यता में सन्निहित रहा है या नहीं, और फिर धीरे धीरे इतिहास में उसका विकास हुआ है या नहीं, यह एक ऐसा प्रश्न है जिस पर राष्ट्रवादी नेता और इतिहासकार लगातार बहस करते रहे हैं। अभी एकदम हाल में प्रसेनजीत द्वारा ने ऐसे विचारों को ज्ञानोदय एनलाइटमेंट के इतिहास का प्रयोजनवादी टेयोलॉजिकल मॉडल कहकर इसकी समालोचना की है और कहा है कि यह मॉडल विवादित और सांप्रदायिक राष्ट्र को एकता की एक मिथ्या भावना से लैस करता है। फिर भी इस बात पर अभी तक असहमति कम ही है कि 19वीं सदी में ब्रिटिश साम्राज्यवाद का सामना जिस भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद ने किया, जिसने 1947 में भारतीय राष्ट्रीय राज्य के जन्म के रूप में अपनी जीत का जश्न मनाया, वह उपनिवेशी आधुनिकता की उपज था। चूँकि उपनिवेशकों का स्वघोषित उद्देश्य उपनिवेशितों को उनकी पतन की तत्कालीन अवस्था से ऊपर उठाकर आधुनिकता की दिशा में प्रगति की एक वांछित अवस्था तक लाना था, इसलिए उपनिवेशितों के लिए अपने ऊपर लगे पिछड़ेपन के ठप्पे को चुनौती देना और यह दावा करना आवश्यक हो गया कि एक आधुनिक राज्य के ढांचे में वे भी एकजुट होने और अपना शासन स्वयं चलाने में समर्थ हैं। इसलिए उपनिवेशी भारत में राष्ट्रवाद के सामने दोहरी चुनौती थी, राष्ट्रीय एकता स्थापित करना और आत्मनिर्णय के अधिकार का दावा करना। हर कोई इस बात पर सहमत है कि भारत एक बहुलवादी समाज है जिसमें क्षेत्र, भाषा, धर्म, जाति, उपजाति आदि अनेक प्रकार की विविधताएं हैं। यदि सुरेंद्रनाथ बनर्जी के शब्दों का प्रयोग करें तो आधुनिक भारतीय राष्ट्र के आरंभिक निर्माताओं में से एक थे, जो इसी विविधता से एक राष्ट्र का निर्माण हो रहा था। लेकिन इतिहासकारों के बीच सहमति बस यहीं तक है। भारतवासी राष्ट्र की कल्पना वास्तव में किस तरह करते थे, यह गहरे विवाद की बहस का विषय है। इस विवाद के एक सिरे पर पार्थ चटर्जी का तर्क है कि भारत में राष्ट्रवाद, जिसे उसके पश्चिमी में शिक्षा प्राप्त राजनीतिक नेताओं ने एक विशिष्ट स्थान दिया था, पश्चिम से एक भिन्न मगर उससे व्युत्पन्न संवाद है। आशीष नंदी की सोच भी यही है कि पश्चिमी राष्ट्रवाद साम्राज्यवाद के प्रत्युत्तर के रूप में भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद ऐसे सभी प्रत्युत्तरों की तरह उसी चीज़ से निर्धारित हुआ है जिसका वह प्रत्युत्तर था। पश्चिमी मध्यवर्गीय भारत ने सार्वभौमवाद की उस वैकल्पिक विचार को रद्द किया जिसकी जड़ें भारतीय सभ्यता में थी और जिन साम्राज्यिक पश्चिम के प्रति आधुनिकतावादी समालोचक रवींद्रनाथ ठाकुर और महात्मा गांधी जैसे व्यक्तियों ने प्रतिपादित किया। सार्वभौमवाद की वैकल्पिक दृष्टि भेदों को स्वीकार कर और उनका रचनात्मक उपयोग करके भारत को राजनीतिक स्तर पर तो नहीं परंतु सामाजिक सतह पर एक कर सकती थी। लेकिन भारतीय राष्ट्रवादियों ने अपने राष्ट्रवाद के निरूपक तत्व के रूप में राष्ट्रीय राज्य के पश्चिमी मॉडल को स्वीकार कर लिया। दूसरी ओर अभी हाल में ही C.A. बेइली ने राष्ट्रवाद के प्रागैतिहास की खोज की है। वे समझते हैं कि भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद ने क्षेत्रीयता के एक पहले से मौजूद भावना पर स्वयं को आधारित किया। पारंपरिक देशभक्ति, जिसे लोक नैतिकता और सदाचारी शासन के देसी विचारों ने बुद्धिवादी रूप दिया, उसके आधार पर स्वयं को खड़ा किया। लेकिन उपनिवेशी शासन से और आपस में दो चार होने के बाद इन क्षेत्रीय एकजुटताओं का किस तरह भारत की एक बृहत्तर सांस्कृतिक धारणा में समन्वय हुआ, यह जोरदार बहस का विषय है। इस प्रक्रिया में अनेक प्रभाव और अनेक अंतर्विरोध थे, चेतना के अनेक स्तर और रूप थे। इस लगभग पूर्ण अराजकता के बीच में किसी एक आयामी चित्र की रचना करना कठिन है। फिर भी चूंकि एक राष्ट्र राज्य जन्म ले चुका था, उसके जीवन चरित्र तैयार करने के प्रयास किए गए हैं। इसका यह अर्थ निश्चित ही नहीं कि जिस भारतीय राष्ट्रीय राज्य के निर्माण के रूप में राष्ट्रवादी मुख्यधारा ने अपना वर्चस्व स्थापित किया, उसके विकास की इस महागाथा के अलावा राष्ट्र को समझने के लिए कुछ वैकल्पिक वृत्तांत थे ही नहीं। आरंभिक राष्ट्रवादी इतिहासकारों ने और उनके कुछ प्रवर्ती अनुयायियों ने भी राष्ट्र निर्माण की इस प्रक्रिया का अध्ययन करते हुए मुख्यतः एक राष्ट्रवादी विचारधारा और एक राष्ट्रवादी चेतना की श्रेष्ठता पर ध्यान केंद्रित किया। चेतना के दूसरे सभी रूपों को जिसके अधीन माना गया राष्ट्र की यह चेतना उपनिवेशी शासन के साझे विरोध पर, देशभक्ति की भावना पर और भारत की प्राचीन परंपराओं में गर्व की भावना पर आधारित विचारधारा पर आधारित था। दूसरे शब्दों में इस इतिहासकार संप्रदाय ने भारतीय समाज के अंदरूनी टकरावों को अनदेखा किया, जिन्होंने अन्य बातों के अलावा दो राष्ट्र राज्यों में उनके विभाजन को जन्म दिया तथा वह संप्रदाय राष्ट्र के इतिहास को सांझे हितों वाली एक समरस इकाई मानकर चलता था। इसके विरोध साझों वाले एक समरस इकाई मानकर चलता था। इसके विरोध में एंग्लो अमेरिकी विद्वानों ने एक नई व्याख्या पेश की है और रजत रे ने अपेक्षाकृत ढीले ढाले ढंग से उन विद्वानों को नव परंपरावादी संप्रदाय कहा है। यह नई व्याख्या वैलेंटाइन शिरोल जैसे लेखकों के उस पुराने साम्राज्यिक दावे को दोहराती थी कि भारतीय समाज का राजनीतिकरण वर्ग या राष्ट्र जैसी आधुनिक धारणाओं की बजाय भाषाई क्षेत्रों, जातियों या धार्मिक समुदायों जैसे परंपरागत सामाजिक संरचनाओं की तर्ज पर हुआ। इस संदर्भ में परिवर्तन के सबसे महत्वपूर्ण उत्प्रेरक उपनिवेशी राजसत्ता के संस्थागत प्रवर्तन, खासकर पश्चिमी शिक्षा और राजनीतिक प्रतिनिधित्व के आरंभ थे। भारतीय समाज के परंपरागत विभाजनों से घात प्रतिघात इन नए अवसरों ने एक नई परिस्थिति समूह को पश्चिमी शिक्षा प्राप्त कुलीन समूहों को जन्म दिया, जिसके सदस्य पहले से मौजूद विशेषाधिकार संपन्न देशी समूहों से आते थे, जैसे बंगाल के भद्रलोक, बम्बई के चीतापावन ब्राह्मण या मद्रास के तमिल ब्राह्मणों से। इस सीमित राजनीतिक राष्ट्र के दायरे से जो पिछड़े क्षेत्र या साधनहीन समूह बाहर रहे, उनकी उपनिवेशी भारत के उस आधुनिक संस्थागत जीवन में कोई पैठ भी नहीं थी जिसके दायरों के अंदर आरंभिक भारतीय राष्ट्रवादियों के संदेश गूंजते थे। यह सबसे पहले विश्व युद्ध के अंत तक चला, जब महात्मा गांधी ने पहली बार संवैधानिक राजनीति के दरवाजों को पूरी तरह खोलकर लोक राष्ट्रवाद के नए युग का सूत्रपात किया। अगर नव परंपरावादी इतिहासकारों ने भारतीय राजनीति का अध्ययन प्रांत के ढांचे में किया, तो कुछ दूसरों ने और भी नीचे जाकर इलाकों के स्तर तक इन विभाजनों की खोज की। इन इतिहासकारों की रचनाओं ने, जिनकी पहचान कैम्ब्रिज संप्रदाय के रूप में की गई है, किसी एकजुट राष्ट्रवादी आंदोलन की सत्ता में संदेह व्यक्त किए हैं और उसके बजाय उपनिवेशी भारत में स्थानीय आंदोलनों की एक पूरी श्रृंखला दर्शाई है। चूंकि साम्राज्यवाद कमजोर था और भारतीय सहयोगियों की सहायता के बिना कुछ नहीं कर सकता था, इसलिए उससे टकराते हुए जो राष्ट्रवाद विकसित हुआ वह भी कमजोर था। वह दो कागजी शेरों की लड़ाई से कुछ अधिक भी नहीं था। चूंकि साम्राज्यिक शासन भारतीय सहयोगियों पर निर्भर था, इसलिए साम्राज्यिक शासकों की कृपा पाने के लिए उनके बीच भी प्रतिस्पर्धा चलती रहती थी। इसके कारण विभिन्न हितवत समूह उत्पन्न हुए, जिन्होंने तब अपने प्रभाव क्षेत्र
Hello, now we are going to start unit number 2, Reformism and Anti-Reformism in 19th century, from the reading of Plassey to Partition. So here we are going to start from chapter number 3, Early Indian Responses, Reform and Rebellion, Social and Religious Reforms. The early policy of the East India Company was that of non-intervention in Indian social matters, along with pragmatism that demanded continuation of existing systems. There was also a respect for traditional Indian culture that expressed itself in Warren Hastings' policy of Orientalism. It meant, as we have discussed in the previous chapter, an attempt to learn about Indian culture through a study of scriptures in Sanskrit and Persian language, and to use that knowledge in matters of governance. The result of this endeavor was the establishment of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the Calcutta, Madras, and the Sanskrit College at Banaras. Knowledge about the subject population, their social customs, manners, and codes were regarded as a necessary prerequisite for developing permanent institutions of rule. Hastings' policy to govern the conquered in their own ways and resist Anglicization thus reflected Orientalist ideological preference and also political pragmatism. Since the end of Hastings' tenure, there was a gradual move toward cautious intervention in Indian social institutions. What contributed to this shift, as we have seen earlier, were several ideological influences in Britain, such as evangelicalism, utilitarianism, and free trade thinking. While the utilitarians began to talk of appropriate social engineering and authoritarian reformism, the evangelists argued about the necessity of government intervention to liberate Indians from their religions that were full of superstitions, idolatry, and tyranny of the priest. The free trade thinkers who wanted government intervention to free Indian economy from the shackles of traditions to ensure a free flow of trade. But the company's government was still tentative protective about interfering for fear of adverse Indian reaction. It could not do so unless a section of the Indian society was prepared to support reform. Such a group that would support wide-ranging social reforms in India was soon to emerge through the introduction of English education, which became therefore the first and most important area of intervention and innovation for the complete state in India. English education was introduced in India in the 18th century through the charity schools run in Calcutta, Madras and Bombay for the education of the European and Anglo-Indian children. The company supported these schools in various ways but did not take any direct responsibility for the education of the indigenous population until 1813. Charles Grant's advocacy of English education to be introduced in India fell on deaf ears before the Charter Act of 1793 for fear of political unrest. His major concern was, however, about the misrule of the company officials. The real hegemony of the British, he thought, could be established in India through a display of the superior moral and ethical values of the West as manifested in its Christian heritage. Christian instruction was the best guarantee against rebellion, as it would rescue the natives from their polytheistic Hinduism and make them parts of the assimilative project of colonialism. But the missionaries still remained banned from entering India for another 20 years. Despite the ban, the missionaries continued to use various ingenious means to arrive in the country and work for the dissemination of Western education, which they believed would lead to proselytization. Thus, while the Protestant missionaries started working from the Danish station in Madras from the early 18th century, the Srimpur Danish settlement near Calcutta became towards the end of the century. The refuse of three Baptist missionaries, Dr. William Carey, Ward and Joshua Marsman, apart from running a printery and translating the Bible into local language, they also ran schools for both boys and girls. Unless they directly offended the religious sensibilities of the local population, the company's government tolerated such missionary activity, the number of which before 1813 was, however, very small. The real beginning of Western education in India can therefore be dated from the Charter Act of 1813, which not only allowed the missionaries to travel to India but provided for the allocations of 100,000 rupees per year for two specific purposes. First, the encouragement of the learned natives of India and the revival of and improvement of literature. Secondly, the promotion of a knowledge of the science amongst the inhabitants of that country. This was unprecedented in an age when publicly funded education was not in vogue even in England. The immediate concern of the Parliament in forcing the company into this commitment was once again the corruption and degeneracy of its officials in India. But beyond that, there was also an agenda for greater territorial control. The officials rampantly exploited the country as they viewed it as a temporary territorial possession, argued Charles Grant. So greater commitment to the development of the natives would provide a greater sense of security, or in other words, a sense of duty to the people would lead to the development of a context for greater consolidation of power. But this decision did not immediately decide the nature of education to be provided for the Indians, as this specific clause 43 was rather vague in its language and was open to interpretation. In official thinking in India, the Orientalist thoughts were still powerful, having received strong support in a then recent minute of Lord Minto, the Governor General between 1806 and 1813. The new General Committee of Public Instruction was dominated by the Orientalists, who interpreted the clause to mean advancement of Indian classical literature and the sciences of the land. The program they chalked out was for the establishment of a Sanskrit college in Calcutta, two more Oriental colleges at Agra and Delhi, and patronage for the tolls and madrasa as institutions of indigenous learning. In the meanwhile, however, public attention in India was steadily being drawn away from this tradition of indigenous classical learning. Christian missionaries and European individuals like David Hare started opening schools in all parts of India, where school became the medium of instruction, and then the Calcutta School Book Society and later Calcutta School Society began to promote vernacular schools for elementary education. The tide seemed to shift decisively in the other direction when Raja Ram Mohan Rai sent a memorandum to the Governor General protesting against the founding of the Sanskrit College in Calcutta. Roy represented a great generations of Indians who believed that modernization of India come through English education and the dissemination of knowledge of the Western sciences. The balance finally titled in favor of the Anglist when William Bentinck, a utilitarian reformist, took over as Governor General in 1828, and Thomas Babington Macaulay was appointed the law member in his council in 1834. The latter was immediately appointed the president of the General Committee of Public Instruction. On 2 February 1835, he issued his famous Minute on Indian Education, which became the blueprint for the introduction of English education in India, full of contempt for Oriental learning. Macaulay's Minute asserted that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. When he advocated, therefore, for the Indians was an education in European literature and sciences inculcated through the medium of English language. Such an education, he argued, would create a class of persons between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellect. Bentinck immediately endorsed his proposals in an executive order of 7 March 1835 and did not budge from this position despite loud protests from the Orientalists. Thus, as Sabyasachi Bhattacharya has put it, a new education system was introduced in India in which the task of producing knowledge assigned to the metropolitan country, while its reproduction, replication and dissemination were left for the colonized people. This was the beginning of the new modernization project for India. English education, as Gauri Vishwanath has argued, was present in India in various forms before 1835. But while previously English was studied in a classical fashion primarily as a language, the new shift was toward the study of literature as a medium of modern language. English literature, it was believed, was an ideal representation of English identity, sanitized and abstracted from the more immediate history of exploitation and oppression. Moreover, it would inculcate an appropriate training in morality, ethics and correct behavior, and thus incorporate a group of natives into the structure of colonial rule, which was the main political agenda of Anglicism. The major feature of this new English education policy was therefore the theory of downward filtration. It was not meant for the masses but for the rich, the learned, the men of business, as C.E. Trevelyan described them, as they already had a literate tradition, had eagerness as well as means to learn, and above all had sufficient leisure. Once these men were trained, they could act as teachers, and through them elementary education would percolate downward through regional language at much less public expenditure. Thus, the whole indigenous society would benefit from Western knowledge and superior morals and ethical ideals. The reports of William Adam recommending improvements of vernacular education through indigenous village schools were therefore ignored for being impractical and expensive. The same model of promoting English education and higher education at the expense of classical and vernacular learnings as well as elementary education was extended also to the Bombay and Madras presidencies. However, in the northwestern provinces, Thomson's, an enthusiastic civilian, experimented with the vernacular elementary schools, and he was so successful that Lord Dalhousie later recommended its extension to Bengal and Bihar. In 1854, Charles Wood's Education Dispatch also signaled a similar shift away from the downward filtration policy, as it recommended the extension of vernacular elementary education, which was endorsed by Dalhousie's administration. However, even in the shifting focus towards elementary mass education, it is not difficult to see a concern for the political economy of the empire that rested on the idea of division of labor. This policy proposed that while a relatively small group of highly educated Indians would be needed to man the subordinate positions in the administration, the wider population should also have useful and practical knowledge in order to become good workers capable of developing the vast resources of the empire, and also become good consumers while valuing the superior quality of British goods requiring a market. So while elementary and technical education was advocated for the masses, higher education was also given a further boost in 1857 through the creation of 3 universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras on the model of University of London, which was found to be the most suited to colonial conditions. Secondary schools where the medium of instruction was still English proliferated under the liberal grants in aid scheme with missionary and private Indian initiatives, but these schools were required to charge a fee as free education, it was argued, would not be properly valued. The scheme was replaced in 1859 by Secretary of State Stanley's idea of an education rate, and vernacular elementary education suffered most as a result. The Indian Education Commission in 1882 tried unsuccessfully to resolve the problem of duality in the education system by seeking to readjust the balance between higher English literary education for a few and elementary and technical education for the masses. It is desirable, its report said, that the whole population of India should be literate, and to ensure such general literacy, it recommended special funds to be set apart particularly for the education of backward communities. Yet such backward groups as the vast community of Dalits or the untouchables continued to be excluded from state schools, as their presence would drive away the higher caste pupils who were meant to be the main target population for the colonial education system. This exclusion happened with the active support of the colonial bureaucracy, succumbing in the name of practicality to the pressures of the conservative sections of the Indian elite, many of whom had by now become grassroots level functionaries of the empire. British education policy thus endorsed and supported differentiation in Indian society. By 1885, there was in India, according to B.T. Macaulay calculation, an English-educated class of about 55,000 natives. But in 1881-82, out of total population of more than 195 million, only a little more than 2 million had attended elementary schools. The impact of this differentiation on social and political development of India was indeed far-reaching. But it was with various motives that English education was introduced in India, and its continuous expansion sustained. For missionaries, it was supposed to open the gates for proselytization of the Indians. For utilitarians, it was the ultimate fulfillment of Britain's imperial mission. Imparting education to natives is our moral duty, said Lord Myro in 1815. On the other hand, East India Company from the beginning of the 19th century was seeking to reduce the cost of governing India by Indianizing the subordinate positions in the administrative structure, particularly in the judicial and revenue branches. Manning the administrative exclusively with Englishmen was no longer financially feasible, nor it was politically expedient. A proper education in English, the language spoken by the ruling class, as Macaulay defined it, was therefore a means to train them for each such subordinate public services. However, speaking like the Englishman was not enough, they had to think and behave like Englishmen as well. This pedagogic enterprise of imperialism therefore was to inculcate a spirit of loyalty among its Indian subjects who would believe in its providential nature and its civilizing missions. Gauri Vishwanathan has argued that the colonial education system deployed English literary studies in its curriculum as an instrument for enduring industriousness, efficiency, trustworthiness, and compliance in native subjects. But as a moral study, it did not function as effective in India as it did in England. Firstly, because there were not enough materials rewards for liberal education in India, but more seriously because the educated Indians selectively adopted the knowledge and deployed it to interrogate colonial rule itself. So the colonial regime could never abandon the policy of using direct force to uphold its hegemony, and maintained for this purpose elaborate police and army establishments through the period. But its social control was certainly buttressed, as K.N. Panikkar argues as well, by an illusion created by ideological influences. which always remained the central concern of the imperial educational enterprises. The Indians who were attracted to English education were predominantly Hindu upper caste male from middle and lower income groups who were economically very hard pressed due to changes of the time. For most of them, education had a functional utility. It was a means of survival in difficult times, a tool for achieving economic prosperity and getting power rather than just a pathway to intellectual enlightenment. However, when the material expectation faltered, it was their knowledge which became their best weapon for comforting an authoritarian colonial state, a story we will return to in the next chapter. Protagonists of English education like B.T. Macaulay argued long time ago that English education brought the native youth in contact with a body of thought which openly questioned many of the fundamental assumptions upon which the fabric of traditional values rested. More precisely, we may identify this new body of thought as post-Enlightenment rationalism, which came to define modernity for a select group of educated Indians. They began to look at their own society through a prism ideological constructed by such concepts as reason, utility, progress, and justice. In 1893, Rabindranath Tagore noted the emergence of a public in India, which was not yet matured but keen to debate publicly through their newspapers and voluntary associations various issues affecting the well-being of their society. In other words, there was the rise of civil society, though very limited it was, but articulate in defending its right while locating its identity in an Indian tradition. But this tradition, it was also felt, needed reform because within this specific colonial and ideological context, all existing social practices and religious notions appeared to be signs of a descendant feudal society that had to be remodeled according to the values of a bourgeois social order. In other words, enlightenment seemed to be the panacea for all the evils and backwardness that Indians were being blamed for. For this new elite striving to move forward in a new global order intellectually defined for them by colonialism, science now became a universal sign of modernity and progress and came to constitute, as Gyan Prakash had suggested, an authoritative language of reform. Although the colonial state would not provide scientific education for the Indian masses, intellectuals like Ram Mohan Roy proposed for his countrymen an education system that would focus on Western sciences. In Calcutta in 1825, a society for translating European sciences was set up, followed by the establishment of the Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge in 1838. This movement, which saw the development of scientific education as the key to national improvement, reached a major milestone when the Bengali intellectual Mahendra Lal Sirwar established in 1876 the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Sciences. And if this discourse was first started by a small circle of enlightened Calcutta elite, it was soon universalized as it spread to other provinces through the development of a new print culture in North India. For example, the Banaras Debating Club, founded in 1861, the Aligarh Scientific Society, founded in 1864 by Syed Ahmad Khan, and Bihar Scientific Society, started in 1868, contributed to this discourse on the power of science, which then began to pervade the new territories of Hindi literary movements and Hindu revivalist campaigns. However, the problem was to translate this scientific rationalist mentality of an elite into an effective social reform agenda affecting and involving the larger public. This new mentality had first become most conspicuous among the students of Henry Vivian de Rozia, a Eurasian teacher at the Hindu College in Calcutta, who developed among his pupils a spirit of free thinking. This controversial group, known as the Young Bengal, became notorious in their own times for their individual social rebellion manifested through winning and dining in forbidden meat. But what was more important about them was that they posed an intellectual challenge to the religious and social orthodoxy of Hinduism. It was they who formed in 1838 the Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge, where they discussed various aspects of Western science and stood for a number of social reforms such as the prohibition of caste taboos, child marriage, kuleen, polygamy, or the ban on widow remarriage. Yet they could not usher in the desired age of reform. Their total faith in the British and in English education, their rationalism and scientism derived from the West set them apart from the masses of Indians, and they never succeeded in organizing any social movements in support of their proposed reforms. Their professed atheism, which was so evolved at the initial phase, declined soon, and their social radicalism too showed signs of backsliding as they grew older and became established in society. Thus, ultimately, as Sumit Sarkar concludes, the young Bengal, the followers of Darozia, left little distinctive or permanent impression on the plane of reason and philosophy in 19th century India. The challenge of the other Indian reformers of this period was to rediscover reason and science in their own civilization and to reposition the modernization project within a cultural space defined by Indian tradition. These new intellectual stirrings created a reform mentality that did not reject Indian tradition but sought to change certain unreasonable aspects of Hindu society which did not conform to their new rationalist image of glorious Indian past. This provided legitimacy to the reform agenda of the utilitarian reforms like William Bentinck, but since this mentality was still confined to a small circle of English-educated elite, the reform program could hardly be expected to succeed. Indeed, in the early 19th century, a series of social reforms followed, being mainly reform from above through government fight, and as expected, these reforms remained on the paper in most cases, as there was never any attempt to develop a modern social consciousness from below. Lord Wellesley, for example, in 1803 banned the religious custom of child sacrifice at Sagar Island in the Bay of Bengal, but although this ritual practice was stopped, the less visible social practice of female infanticide continued unabated in western and northern India, where land-owning high-caste families practicing hypergamy found it difficult to get suitable grooms for their daughters or pay high amounts of dowry, and resorted to clandestine killing of people offspring at the time of birth. The British authorities sometimes tried to pursue them, and after 1830 sought to coerce them to desist from the practice with little tangible effect. The talks of legal ban were halted by the revolt of 1857 and were kept on hold until 1870, when finally the Female Infanticide Act was passed by the Viceroy's Council. But even after that, the census authorities reported abject neglect of female children, resulting in high mortality that could not be detected or prevented by the law. The greatest achievement that Lord Bentinck is remembered for is the prohibition of sari or self-immolation of widows on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. It was a social practice prevalent in India from ancient times, but as a modern researcher confirms, it has always been very much the exception rather than the rule in Hindu life. During the Mughal period, it was practiced only by the Rajput princely families in central India and Rajasthan, and in the Kingdom of Vijayanagara in South India. During the British period in the large 18th and early 19th century, the practice was revived on a wider scale in areas which experienced the highest rate of development under British administration, that is, the capital city of Calcutta and districts around it. Here it became popular not only among the upper castes but also among the peasant family of lower and intermediate caste, who achieved social mobility and then sought to legitimize their new status by imitating their caste superiors. Apart from this sociological reason and the religious notion of an ideal wife who would follow her husband in life and in death, the occur factor was the greed of the relatives, which the new prosperity of the families had possibility engendered. The practice had become most widespread in those areas where the Dayabhaga schools of personal Hindu law was applicable as compared to the Mitaksara school. It allowed the widow relatively greater right to inherit her deceased husband's property. Although the Christian missionaries had first started attacking the institution, it was a strong abolitionist campaign under Raja Ram Mohan Rai that gave the movement its real momentum. Finally, Governor General Bentinck prohibited sari in 1829 by a government regulation which could not be overturned by Hindu petition from the anti-abolitionist Dharma Sabha to the Privy Council in 1830. But although the incidence of sari declined gradually after the regulation, the idea and the myth of sati persisted in popular culture despite a modernist critique of the Western educated middle classes and the reformist zeal of the colonial administration. The idea was continually affirmed through epics, ballads and folk tales, to reappear again in public life as late as in 1987 in the much publicized sari of Roop Kanwar at a village Derola in Rajasthan. Even more effective was the other reform movement of the mid-19th century that sought to promote widow remarriage. Its main protagonist, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, like his predecessors Ram Mohan Rai, also looked to the colonial state for a piece of legislation. The Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1556, which legalized such marriage, could not, however, make this practice socially acceptable. On the contrary, as Lucy Carroll has argued, the legislation was instinctively conservative in character, as on remarriage it disinherited the widow of her deceased husband's property and thus endorsed the Brahminical norm of rewarding only the caste prayerful widow. The movement ended in what Vidyasagar's biographer Ashok Sen has called an unavoidable defeat. He failed to see many widows remarried. As for that, he needed special social consent, which could not be generated by the power of colonial state. As a result, not only the practice of widow remarriage remained rare and exceptional among the educated classes in Bengal, but in next few decades the taboo came to be further universalized and it became a forbidden practice even among the lower orders. The situation was no different in Western India, where as early as 1841 an anonymous Maharashtrian Brahman reformer had advocated remarriage of infant widows as measure to control their sexuality and make their reproductive capacity socially useful. The movement to promote widow remarriage spread among the Western educated middle class in the 1860s, and debate between the reformers and their detractors also become Harper and bitter. In 1866, Vishnu Sastri Pandit started a society for the encouragement of widow remarriage, while his opponents also formed a rival organization. In 1870, the reformists suffered a setback when, in a public debate in Pune, they were found to be at fault by Sankaracharya of Kavir Math, and many of them accepted the ritual of penance. Although there were exceptional widows like Pandita Ramabai, who made her mark in Maharashtrian public life, the movement for the remarriage of widows ended in a whimper, as by the end of century only 38 widows had been remarried. And in those cases too, the couples were subjected to enormous social pressure and ostracism. And now the prohibition on widow remarriage became even more widespread, as it became also a lower caste social practice, despite non-Brahman social reformer Jyotirao Phule's spirited attacks on enforced celibated widowhood. In the Telugu-speaking areas of Madras Presidency, the reform movement in support of widow remarriage was started by Veerasalingam Pandrulu, who founded in 1878 a society for social reform for this purpose. The first widow remarriage in the region was officiated by him in 1881 in his hometown Rajamundry, in the face of stiff opposition. Gradually, support for the reform increased, and in 1891 a widow remarriage association was formed with the patronage of the prominent citizens of the town. But this enthusiasm notwithstanding, by this time only 3 such marriages had been arranged by the reformers. The situation varied widely from region to region, for in Haryana, where the practice of widow remarriage was already in vogue at a large scale, the new act provided such marriage with legitimacy and further social acceptance. The colonial legislation for reform, in other words, had a very uneven impact on Indian society. In Bengal, Vidyasagar continued his reform movement, directing it against polygamy and later child marriage, and finally secured an age of consent act in 1860 that fixed the age of consent for the consummation of marriage at 10 years for women. He was raised to 12 by another legislation in 1891, but as census statistics show, child marriage continued to be a widely practiced social custom among all the castes, high and low alike, well into the 20th century. Reform from above, more specifically through legislations, remained ineffective in other areas too, where it was directed against specified or organized religious or social practices. The British conquest of the Deccan and central India by the beginning of the 19th century created the reformist urge to establish Pax Britannica in those unsettled territories. But that became a difficult proposition, as the disbanding of armies by the Indian serfs and the general contraction of job opportunities increased the rate of crime, particularly robbery by roving armed gangs. To this was added the official distrust for the wandering monastic orders, which challenged the very British ideal of a settled, tax-paying peasant community. Hence, all these various peripatetic groups were stereotyped into a colonial construct called thugs, who were believed to have been members of a fraternity traditionally involved in robbery and ritual killing in the name of religion. The campaign against thug was initiated in the 1830s in assertion of the same humanitarian mission of British paramountcy championed by Lord Bentinck. The purpose of the campaign, as Radhika Singha has argued, was not to root it out through education or regeneration of the indigenous society. The Thug Act of 1836 and the Thug Department were simply aiming at policing and prosecuting gangs seen as perpetrating a crime in the name of religion, but it proved to be a difficult task. In 1839, Sir William Sleeman, the architect of the campaign, claimed that thug as an organized system had been exterminated. In reality, what happened was that he realized the difficulty of prosecuting various groups of peripatetic descents on charges of thug. He therefore preferred to try more flexible strategies for policing such communities. Legislative reforms were even more ineffective against less visible or less organized social customs that remained part of people's everyday culture for centuries. An ideal example of this was the abolition of slavery in 1843. Slavery had been abolished in Britain in 1820, and in India the colonial administrations continued to detect its existence in various forms. The agrarian relations in India were complex, marked by numerous structures of labor dependencies, many of which viewed through the post-Enlightenment lens of the unfreedom opposition looked like slavery in British eyes. The Charter Act of 1833 therefore instructed the government of India to abolish slavery, and parliamentary pressure continued to mount until its legal abolition. But since the actual forms of bondage differed, particularly so far as aggressive slavery was concerned, the impact of the legal ban was also very limited. Caste, customs and debt kept the agricultural laborers bonded to their landlords in various ways and for a very long time to come. It is interesting to note that women's status became the main focus of the reforming activities of the colonial state as well as of the educated Indians. To a large extent, it was the result of a comparative civilization discourse of the colonial period. In the other words, when civilization were ranked, one of the major criteria was the position of women, and it was here that the Indians were increasingly under attack by the Western observers, from missionaries to civilians. To put it differently, Indian civilization was despised because it assigned such a low status to women. This gender question was a key issue for James Mill, condemning Indian civilization in his theory of British India. So the Indian intelligentsia LO responded to this civilizational critique by advocating and supporting reforms to improve the status of women in Indian society. Such reforms, as we have seen, affected only a few women belonging to their own classes, and that too in a very restricted way, as these women remained recipients of male patronage and never become involved in this reformist project as conscious subjects of their own history. This early 19th century public discourse on reform thus not only had limited impact on society as a whole, it also signified the patriarchal control of the educated Indian males over the private sphere or the domestic arena reserved for women. It is simplistic to suggest that the great reformers of the educated Indian elite to such civilizational critique was to reform Hinduism from within in the light of post-Enlightenment rationalism. This phenomenon is often celebrated in the older historiography as the Bengal Renaissance or 19th century Indian Renaissance. Although the use of the term Renaissance is problematic, this cultural movement essentially involved attempts to discover rationalism in India's past and thus to reposition her religious and philosophical traditions within the critical terrain of reason. The movement was started in Bengal by Raja Ram Mohan Rai, who is often described as the father of modern India. He was one of those upper caste gentry whose power and position had been enhanced by the permanent settlement and other opportunities opened by colonial rule. Ram Mohan imbibed rationalism from his early training in the 18th century Perso-Arabic literature. Eventually, he studied Vedantic monism and after his migration to Calcutta in 1815 was exposed to Christian Unitarianism. Such intellectual influences motivated him to contest the missionary claim of superiority of Christianity. His answer was to reform Hinduism in the light of reason by going back to its purest form as inherent in the Vedanta texts. He condemned idolatry, priestcraft and polytheism, and translated the Upanishads into Bengal to demonstrate that ancient Hindu scriptures themselves propagated monotheism. Roy's first organization, Atmiya Sabha, founded in Calcutta in 1815, eventually took the shape of Brahmo Samaj in 1828. It emerged as a major religious movement of the middle-class educated Bengalis based on the essential principle of monotheism. After Roy's death in 1833, the leadership of the Brahmo movement was taken over by Devendranath Tagore, who provided the movement with a better organizational structure and ideological consistency, but the movement was actually taken out of the limited elite circles of Calcutta literary into the district towns of East Bengal by Bijoy Kirshan Goswami and Kasub Chandra Sen in the 1860s. Goswami bridges the gap between Brahmoism and the popular religions tradition of Vaishnavism, while Sen's specific focus was to reach larger numbers of non-westernized Bengalis in the eastern Gangetic plains and to take the movement outside Bengal to other provinces of India. In Western India, reformism began in the early 19th century in two different ways. One was the Orientalist method of exploring and translating ancient Sanskrit texts and rediscovering in them the glories of Indian civilization. The most notable core reformers involved in this project were K.T. Telang, V.N. Mandlik, and above all Professors R.G. Bhandrakar. The other trend was represented by the more direct method of social reform, attacking such institutions as caste system or prohibition of widow remarriage. The Parthana Samaj maintained its distinctions from the Brahmo movement of Bengal. The most notable distinction was in its cautious approach in contrast to the relatively more confrontational attitudes of the Bengali Brahmas. The peculiar feature of the movement in Presidency, Ranade pointed out, was that its goal was not to break with the past and seize all connections with our society. The reformers set southward to come gradually, not cataclysmically wrecking the structure of society. Modernization, in other words, was to be accommodated within the cultural space of tradition without signaling a sharp break. It was this gradualist approach which made Parthana Samaj relatively more acceptable to the larger society. Branches were opened in Pune, Surat, Ahmedabad, Karachi, Kirki, Kolhapur and Sarara. Its activists also spread to South India, where the movement was led by the Telugu reformer Veersalingam Penrulu. By the beginning of the 20th century, there was 18 branches in the Madras Presidency. But on the other hand, this cautious approach also brought the Prathna Samaj faced to visit with its first crisis. In 1875, Swami Dayanand Saraswati visited Gujarat and Maharashtra and offered the possibilities of a more radical and self-assertive religious movement. A group of Samaj members under the leadership of S.P. Khelkar felt attracted to the Swami's Aryan ideology and broke away. This rupture in the tradition of reforms came through the religious movement started by Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded his Arya Samaj in 1875. The Dayanand invoked the authority of the Vedas as the most authentic Indian religious text and sought to purge Hinduism of all its post-Vedic associations. It is difficult to ignore the Western Orientalist touch in his discourse that tried to project Hinduism as a religion of the book like Christianity and Islam. But what is more important, in his aggressive response to the West, he fully appropriated the Western intellectual discourse of reason and science and deployed them against his adversaries. He claimed that the Vedas alone contained scientific truths and therefore the religion based on these texts was superior to Christianity and Islam. On the authority of the Vedas, he attacked idolatry, polytheism, ritualistic religion dominated by the Brahman priest, condemned child marriage and stood for widow remarriage, intercaste marriage and female education. Interestingly, there were the reformers that the Western reformers were advocating. He also denounced the untouchability and repudiated caste system, but at the same time he upheld the fourfold Varna division, the retaining the core of the Indian social organization. The brutality or the irrationality of the custom or the plight of women whom the reform was intended for were lesser concerns in a debate which was more on the definition of tradition. In Mani's word, the women are neither subject nor object but rather the ground of the discourse on sati. Women themselves are marginal to the debate. The same thing can be said of the debate on widow remarriage and later on the prohibition of female infanticides. The scriptures lately valorized by the Orientalists thus provided legitimacy for social reforms, and women were denied agency in their own emancipation. This brings us to inner tensions of colonial modernity, as it is not proper to say that the Indian reformist discourse just reflected some colonial formulation. The early writings of Ram Mohan Rai are indeed full of humanistic pleas to ameliorate the condition of Indian womanhood. He talked of scriptures when advocating the abolition of sati, as that was how he could sell his reform to a cautious colonial government and to a reticent Hindu society reluctant to accept challenge. But this traditionalism, notwithstanding his clinching arguments, as Tapan Rai Chaudhary has pointed out, anticipate the idioms and sentences of contemporary feminism. Roy's rationalism was indeed pre-colonial. In his early writings in Persian, he had taken a totally rational approach to religion that nearly amounted to a negation of religion itself. However, after his contact with Christianity and Western free trade thinking in Calcutta, he became more moderate, or perhaps more ambivalent. One has to admit that a sharp tradition or modernization dichotomy is not intellectually conducive to understanding the process of reform in 19th century India. The perceptible ambivalence in the position of the reformers was clearly the outcome of a colonial context. Again, the claims of a totalizing influence of the colonial discourse, one may point out that no hegemony is ever that absolute that is allow no space for autonomy. Although Indian modernizers looked toward the colonial side for support and direction, and post Enlightenment rationality shaped their visions, they could neither leave their tradition nor forget their Indian identity. The Indian modernization project therefore always felt a compulsion to construct a modernity that would be located within Indian cultural space. To summarize their position in Christopher Jeffrelot's words, they undertook to reform their society and its religious practices in order to adapt them to Western modernity while preserving the core of Hindu tradition. It was through this project that the cultural essence of Indian nationhood and its difference from the colonizing West were gradually imagined by the Indian intelligentsia. However, the inherent ambivalence or tensions within this culture enterprise later made it appear weak and rendered it vulnerable to the more aggressive assertions of tradition in the late 19th century. This later cultural movements too, as were involved in a complex intellectual project of interrogating and adjusting at the same time to the colonial constructs of Indian tradition. It's unit 1 and it is mentioned from page number 234 to 276. So we are starting from 234. Political extremism in the second half of the 19th century was not just a reaction to moderate failures. It drew its inspiration and ideology from a cultural and intellectual movements that developed simultaneously with and parallel to moderate politics of the Indian National Congress. The movement is regularly referred to as Hindu revivalism, which generally meant, despite the existence of various trends and contradictory tendencies, an attempt to define Indian nation primarily in terms of Hindu religious symbols, myths, and history. Religion was never totally detached from politics in India, nor was it ever exclusively confined to private space, but so far as public discourse on religion were concerned, one has to make a distinction between two different trends within it, that is, between reform and revival. The reform movements, in which a number of moderate politicians were involved, essentially attempted to bring change in Hindu social organization and practices from within to bring them into conformity with new rationalist ideals of the West. The creation of a National Social Conference is an adjacent body to the National Congress in 1887 is an indication of this mentality. Although religion was kept deliberately out of its agenda. The issues it discussed and reforms it recommended to various provincial organizations had strong religious implications. These movements were both influenced by Western post-Enlightenment rationalist ideas and were also responses to the challenge of westernizing forces and their critiques of Hindu civilization. It was this second aspect of reformism that eventually led to revivalism. For too many Indians, reform, which was often backed by the colonial government, appeared to be an inadequate response or indeed a surrender to Western critics and import rationalist ideas. Nationalism and reformism seem to be contradictory ideas, as Charles Hemsworth 1964 has argued, and this led to the growth of anti-reformism based on a sense of pride in everything Indian. This is what is often referred to as revivalism, marked as it was by a conceptualization of a glorious Hindu past believed to have been degenerated under Muslim rule and threatened by the British. This glorification of Hindu civilization over Islamic or Western often boiled down to attempts to exalt and rationalize Hindu institutions and practices, sometimes even to the point of offering articulate resistance to urgent social reforms. The late 19th century witnessed the gradual weakening of the reformist trend and the strengthening of such revivalist forces, but this revivalism was not just obscurantism, as it had a strong political overtone dictated by the historical need of sculpting a modern Indian nation. Among the reformist organizations, the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal, which was more modernist in its approach, was weakened after the 1870s by internal dissent and divisions. This was followed by the emergence of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in the Christian Paramahansa. The Brahman says at Dakshineshwar near Calcutta was to the mind and emotions completely untouched by Western rationalist education. He offered simple interpretations of Hinduism which became immensely popular among the Western educated Bengalis, tormented by their subjugation to the drudgery of clerical jobs in foreign mercantile or government offices. Ramakrishna's teaching offered the possibility of an escape into an inner world of bhakti despite the binding disciplines of alien jobs. Thus, although in his teachings there is hardly any direct reference to colonial rule, there is, however, an open rejection of the values imposed by Western education and the routine life of a time-bound job or chakri. The educated middle class in the 19th century often found the domain of reason to be oppressive, as it implied the historical necessity of the civilizing colonial rule. Therefore, in the teaching of this uneducated saint at Dakshineshwar, the subordinated middle class found the formulation of a new religion, which, to use Partha Chatterjee's phrase, appropriated, sanitized, and classicized the popular tradition into a national religious discourse. Ramakrishna was not a revivalist per se, for he inculcated a form of religious eclecticism which did not, however, involve the preaching of an open and fluid syncretism. There are various ways to achieve God, he argued, but one must stick to one's own path in a world of fairly rigid divergence. Ramakrishna's Catholicity therefore soon come to be projected as an essence of Hinduism and became for his disciple Vivekananda a ground for claiming the superiority of Hinduism over all the other religions. It was Vivekananda who infused into the discourse of a missionary zeal. He condemned the other reform movement as elitist and invoked the ideal of social service. The best way to serve God, he emphasized, was to serve the poor people. He founded therefore the Ramakrishna Mission in 1897 as a philanthropic organization. To describe him as a revivalist is to ignore the universalistic aspects of his teaching. Nevertheless, the fact that he drew inspiration from the Vedantic tradition, followed some of the orthodox Hindu rituals, exhibited an intrinsic faith in the glories of Hindu civilization, and nurtured a belief that it had degenerated in recent times, made it possible for the revivalists to appropriate him. His evocation of Hindu glory mixed with patriotism which sought to restore the masculinity of the Indian nation denied to them by their colonial masters had a tremendous impact on the popular mind. His message was therefore misused and misinterpreted to give a revivalist slant to nationalism in Bengal. His evocation of the glories of a Hindu past was popularized, while his transient condemnation of the evils of Hinduism was conveniently forgotten. His philanthropic activities were hardly ever emulated. His criticism of the Brahminical and gender oppression was scarcely ever taken seriously, but he became the patron prophet for a whole generation of extremist leaders and militant revolutionaries dreaming the restrictions of a glorious Hindu India. Gradually, an intellectual tendencies developed in Bengal that sought to legitimize any defense of Hindu traditions as a respectable and acceptable response to the challenge of Western civilization critics. At a more obscurantist level, Sashadhartra Tarakchandani began to invent precedents in ancient India for every modern scientific discovery of the West. Not that he was out there to reject or discredit modern science, but tried to show that everything the modern West claimed to have invented was already known to Indians long ago. Then he believed was the only way to evoke respect for Hinduism among a Western educated middle class devoted to the goddess of reason. The whole campaign took the form of an aggressive propaganda through a number of regional journals and organizations like Bharatvarshia Arya Dharma Procharni Sabha, committed to the idea of reviving the Aryan religion as expounded in the Vedas, Tantras and Purans. On the other hand, there was the more sophisticated intellectual tradition of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, portraying the mythical figure Krishna as the modern politicians and a national builder. It was in his novel Anand Math, published in 1882, that he invented an icon for the nation, the mother goddess identified with the motherland, and the song Bande Mataram, which he composed in exhalation of this once beautiful mother, became the anthem of nationalist movement in India. But the way he imagined this icon shows that although taken from the reporter of Hinduism, it was nonetheless highly unorthodox. Without a revival of the religion of the nation, there was no good possible for India, he believed. But this was not the orthodox ritualistic Hinduism he was talking about, a reconstituted Hinduism, the more rationalist dharma that was regenerative and not obscurantist. In him, therefore, we find quite an unprincipled use of Hinduism, a recognition of its elasticity and its immense internal diversity, which made it possible to stretch its resources to accomplish a task that it was never asked to achieve, that is, to imagine a history that would unite a nation against foreign domination. In Maharashtra, the Ranade Telang School of Reform and their Varthana Samaj had been following a cautious policy of social reform along the lines of least resistance, but by the 1890s they came to be assailed by the radicals and the orthodox elements. Brahmji Malabari's 1884 note on child marriage leading to enforced widowhood led to a countrywide debate on the prohibition of child marriage. This social institution had by then become an issue of public debates as a result of court case in 1884-88 in which Rukhambai, a 20-year-old Hindu woman belonging to the Carpentry caste, was taken to Bombay High Court by her husband Dadaji because she refused to recognize his conjugal rights. She was married as an infant, and after 11 years of separate living, she argued that unconsummated marriage was no longer binding on her. As an adult, she lost the case, which dragged on for 4 years and was threatened with imprisonment, which she avoided through a compromise. Dadaji was, however, a mere pawn in this case, through which the Hindu orthodoxy strived to assert the rights of patriarchy and preserve their preferred way of life. On the other hand, important reformists reformed the Rukhambai Defense Committee, of which Malabari was an important member. Intellectual reformist opinion now exerted a moral pressure on the British to pass the Age of Consent Bill in 1891 to prevent early consummation of marriage. The first act against child marriage had been passed in 1860, and its prohibited consumption of marriage for a Hindu girl below 10 years of age. The new act only proposed to raise the age of consent from 10 to 12. The earlier act had been passed without much opposition, but the new one provoked a powerful Orthodox Hindu backlash, which had a much wider mass base than the reformist movement. Conservative and obscurantist sentiments now converged with the nationalist argument that foreign rulers had no right to interfere with the religious and social customs of the Indians. However, just government intervention was not the issue, as during the same period Hindu orthodox opinion seldom hesitated to accept government legislation against cows later, and just then in the Khumbai case it was the British legal system which the Hindu orthodoxy was using to assert its right. This proposed intervention, as it has been argued, sought to invade that sacred inner space, the family and the household, which the Hindu society had always regarded as impenetrable or inviolate, a sovereign space that could not be colonized. But now the Hindu males were about to lose even this last solitary sphere of autonomy, and therefore a new chronology of resistance was to begin from here. The response to this reform was intense and violent. In Maharashtra, the movement was led by Bal Gangadhar Tilak and his Pune Sarjanik Sabha in alliance with the Pune revivalists, who frequently invoked Hindu Brahman and Maratha glory. As early as January 1985, Tilak had been organizing meetings to oppose government intervention in marriage customs, and now he proposed that education rather than legislation was the most legitimate method of eradication the evil. The debate, however, reached furious proportions toward the end of 1890 after the reported death of an 11-year-old Philomeni from sexual abuse by her husband, 29 years old than her. As the reformist pressure increased for a legislation, the orthodox Marathi generals Kesari and Mahabharata strongly upheld the conservative views about the Garbhadhan ceremony, which required the Hindu girls to be married before reaching puberty, but consumption had to await puberty. Any interference with this custom would put Hinduism in danger. That was the essence of all opposition arguments, and this propaganda spread as far as Bengal, where despite the disapproval of people like Bankim Chandra of Vivekanand, the orthodox elements like Shashadhar Tarak Chandamani and others raised a furor in the pages of Bangabasi. This cacophony of obscurantionist propaganda tended to drown the reformist voice like that of Professor R.G. Bhandrakar of the Pune Dakhan College. Following the Orientalist cognitive tradition of textualizing Indian culture, he showed through meticulous research on the Dharma Shastras that marriage after puberty were allowable and not opposed to Hindu religious laws. We should remember, however, that men like Tilak in their personal lives were hardly ever obscurantists, as his own oldest daughter remained single till the age of 13. But in this debate they found a powerful self-confident rhetoric against foreign rule. As Tanik Sarkar argues, the Hindu woman's body become on the site of struggle that for the first time declared war on the very fundamentals of an alien power knowledge system. However, in this protest against Western reformism and rationalism, the pain and tears of the child wives were completely forgotten. There is one interesting point to note here. All the divergent positions on the consent debate, like the previous social reforms debates of the early 19th century, converged at one point. The reformers, their detractors, as well as the colonial states all agreed that the question of child marriage and its consumption belonged to the realm of religion, which, as Mrinalini Sinha has argued, had long been recognized an autonomous space for native masculinity. Indeed, the masculinist anxieties in England generated support for the opponents of the reform, yet the government in India decided to take a pro-reform interventionist position because the specific political imperatives of the rhyme. Therefore, despite all opposition, the Age of Consent Bill was passed on 19 March 1891 through, as both the reformers and their opponents soon realized it had little more than educative effect. But this debate set an interesting trend, while on the other And on the one hand, reformism had become a part of the nationalist discourse. The anti-reformist and orthodox elements also received immense publicity, and what is more significant, Hinduism now became a useful rhetoric for organizing a more articulate and sometimes even militant opposition to rule. The use of orthodox Hindu religious symbols for political mobilization took a more militant form in the North India through the Arya Samaj and the cow protection movement, which led to widespread communal violence in 1893. Arya Samaj was established in 1875 by Dayanand Saraswati. Gradually, it found a fertile ground in Punjab and the northwestern provinces. It offered a sharp criticism of the existing Hindu practices like idolatry, polytheism, child marriage, widow celibacy, foreign rule, dominance of Brahmins, and caste system. Indeed, what is inculcated was an aggressive assertion of the superiority of ancient Indian religion based on the Vedas over all other faiths. Because of this element, the movement was later absorbed into the dominant pan-Hindu revivalist framework. As Peter Vander Weers argues, the reformist Arya Samaj and their orthodox critics found a common ground in their defense of the Hindu nation. This happened after Dayanand's death in 1883 under his disciples. Nath Jones had shown that aggressiveness increased as a result of Christian missionaries' activities, whose introduced religious competitiveness into the social atmosphere of Punjab. They began to preach and the supremacy of the Arya Dharma, Arya Bhasha, and the Arya Vart, and their propaganda was mainly directed against the Muslims and the Christians. As a direct response to Christian proselytizing activities, the Arya Samaj developed the concept of Suddhi, which aimed at reconversion from Christianity, Islam, and Sikhism. The moderate group within the Samaj was gradually marginalized by 1893, and the militant group became dominant. They became closer to orthodox groups and were involved in violent confrontations with the Muslims. The tensions reached its peak on the issue of cow protection. The importance of cow was always recognized in Indian society as the economy moved from pastoral to agriculture orientation, but in ancient time cow was not regarded as sacred or inviolable. Veneration for cow increased during the medieval period when the rate of cow slaughter increased phenomenally. The Muslim practice of cow sacrifice at the Bakrid festival further increased Hindu veneration of cow as a sacred symbol, but it was never a cause of communal conflict in earlier times, not even in early colonial period. The earlier religious disturbances arose on local issues and subsided quickly. It was only in the late 19th century that the communities began to define their boundaries more closely and began to display more communal aggressiveness. The Hindus clearly lacked organizational integration, and therefore Hindu mobilization took place around the symbol of cow, which communicated a variety of cosmological constructs relevant to both the Brahmanical and devotional traditions of Hinduism. Cow, in other words, was a generally acceptable symbol across regional, linguistic, and denominational barriers. It was first the Kukas, a reformist sect among the Sikhs, who took up the cow protection issue in 1871 in order to galvanize their movement and win more support. During Dayanand's time, the cow protection movement was not overtly anti-Muslim, and by providing economic and nationalist arguments, he also tried to rationalize the movement and give it a certain amount of respectability. But gradually it became an issue of communal rivalry, and the debate over the legal ban on cow slaughter arose. For the Muslims, a cow was cheaper than a sheep or goat or sacrificial purpose. Cow slaughter also had a political meaning for them. It meant a symbolic assertion of freedom from Hindu supremacy. The issue was fought at the modern institutional level of municipalities, legislatures, press, and political meetings. By the middle of 1893, the provocations of counter provocations reached its peak, leading to the outbreak of the first riot in Mao in Azamgarh district over the rival interpretation of a legal ban on cow slaughter. The riots rapidly spread over a wide region. 31 riots took place in the 6 months in Bihar and northwestern provinces. Johan McLean thinks that the riot showed an expanded sense of community membership, breaking down classes and geographical barriers. Immediately after 1893, communal tensions subsided. The cow protection movement also lost its momentum, although it's continued in some areas for some time. This shows that cow itself was perhaps not important. It was being used as a symbol for community mobilization. There was an increasing need for such mobilization along community lines as constitutional questions were now being discussed. New competitive institutions were being created. In such an environment of competition, there was need for both the communities to mobilize along communal lines in order to register their collective presence in the new public space, and the cow served as a handy symbol. Cow protection drew the lines between the two religious communities in North India. These lines were further reinforced by skillful manipulation of other available culture symbols such as language. The Hindi-Urdu controversy began in northwestern provinces and Awadh sometime in the 1860s, but it was revived with great enthusiasm in 1882 when it also spread to other Hindi-speaking regions of North India such as the Punjab and the central provinces. The movement acquired greater intensity in the 1890s with the foundation of the Nagari Pracharani Sabha in 1893 in the holy city of Banaras. Truly speaking, Hindi and Urdu spoken by a great majority of people in North India were the same language written in two scripts. Hindi was written in Devanagari script and therefore had a greater sprinkling of Sanskrit words, while Urdu was written in Persian script and thus had more Persian and Arabic words in it. At the more colloquial level, however, the two languages were mutually intelligible. But since Urdu was officially recognized, there was a concerted campaign to get Nagari recognized for all of official purposes as well as, and the movement proceeded through a literary campaign memorizing the government and editorializing in the local language press. Leading literary figures like Bhartendu Harishchandra, by upholding the classical Sanskrit heritage of Hindi language, emphasized its high status and antiquity, but in the process perjured it of its local and popular traditions. But most significantly, in course of this cultural campaign, Hindi came to be identified with the Hindus and Urdu with Muslims. In the wake of the cow protection riots, there were also other moreover attempts to use Hindu religious and historical symbols for the purpose of political mobilization. In Maharashtra, Tilak's next project, to borrow a phrase, was the political recruitment of God Ganpati. Ever since the days of Peshwas, the Hindu deity of Ganpati or Ganesh used to enjoy official patronage in this region. It was a deity that was equally respected both by the Chitpan Brahmins and the non-Brahmins lower caste, but Ganpati Puja was always a domestic or family affair. In 1893, however, following the Bombay riots generated by the cow protection movement, Tilak and other Chitpan Brahmins of Pune decided to organize it as an annual public festival and to imbue politics in it as a means to bridge the gap between the Brahman-dominated Congress and the non-Brahman masses. Alleging government partiality for the Muslims, he urged the Hindus of Pune to boycott their Muharram festival and participate in public celebration of the Puja for Lord Ganpati. In 1894, to further consolidate the group aspects of the festival, he introduced certain innovations like the installment of large public images of the god and introduction of the movement in which singing parties comprising 20 to several hundred singers at times sang political songs to communicate the message of nationalism to wider masses. As a result, the Hindus who previously participated in the Muharram festival in previous years now largely boycotted it and flocked to the Ganpati festival, and then from 1895 the festival began to spread from Pune to every other part of Deccan. By 1905, 72 towns outside Pune celebrated Ganpati festivals. Nationalism in this way came to be associated with Hindu religious revivalist ideas in the late 19th and early 20th century, but there are certain problems involved in its history, as this modern India of syndicated Hinduism was to large extent the construction of 19th century Western hermeneutics. The term Hinduism was used historically to convey a wide variety of meaning. In a general sense, it meant anything native or Indian. In a narrower sense, it indicates the high culture or religion of India, especially those of Aryan, Brahminical or Vedic region. When in the late 19th century, Indians were asked to identify their religious status in the census returns, Hinduism in popular perception was still not recognizable as a religion with definable boundaries. In 1881, in the column for religion instead of Hindu, many of them mentioned their sect or caste. Such problems of definition continued to haunt the census authorities at least until 1901. This Hinduism therefore appears to be a colonial construct not bound by any specific doctrinal definition or not historically attached to any community in India. The idea of a homogenized Hinduism was constructed, as Ashish Nandy has argued, by the cultural arrogance of post-Enlightenment Europe, which sought to define not only the true West but only the true East. The colonial ethnographic studies and census reports gave a concert definable shape to this concept of religion as community, and the section of the westernized Indians internalized into their collective consciousness and developed into a self-definition. Partha Chatterjee has called this phenomenon the central problematic of early Indian nationalism. In conceiving nationalism, the Indian nationalists were obviously influenced by ideas from European bourgeoisie experience, but Indian nationalism did not develop only because of Western modular influences. As we have already seen, the Indian nationalists felt compelled to talk in the terms of an opposing paradigm. They invoked the past as an alternative to colonial rule. This provided for a viable cultural foundation of nationhood. But this particular mode of conceptualization, we must point out, had also some inherent contradictions and consequent dangers. First of all, as it had been pointed out, this very construction of cultural nationalism was prompted by Orientalist cognition that located Hinduism in a high textual tradition. The tendency here was to turn Hinduism into an organized religion based like Christianity on a recognized text, Vedas for Dayanand and Bhagavad Gita for Vivekanand, thus marginalizing the more liberal and open-ended folk traditions. Where it is folk tradition. And when this reconstituted Hinduism became the foundational idea for imagining a nation, that Hindu nationalism, as Christophe Jaffrelot has convincingly argued, largely reflected the Brahminical view of the high caste reformers. This particular cultural discourse of nationalism therefore failed to appeal to the non-Brahman and lower caste masses of India. It also used the past very selectively and readily accepted, often uncritically, the Orientalist stereotype of medieval Muslim tyranny and decline as against ancient Hindu glory. The inevitably led to the unhappy consciousness of enlightening the Muslims, who became suspicious of Hindu majority rule. This nationalism, which grew in strength in the late 19th century, was thus beset with contradiction from the very beginning. Not only were the Muslims alienated by this militant brand of Hinduism, it has been argued by Richard Fox that the articulation of a distinctive Sikh identity through an organized Singh Sabha movement in the late 19th century was directly the result of the Arya Samaj campaign in Punjab, particularly of its attack on Guru Nanak. It is perhaps simplistic to argue that the Singh Sabhas came up only in the response to the challenge of the Arya Samaj, but it will be pertinent here to have a brief discussion on this movement, as it belongs to the same cultural politics of identity formation in the late 19th century India. There was in fact many reasons behind the rise of this movement, such as the emergence of a small Sikh elite in the 19th century and their indignation about relative exclusion of the Sikhs from education and employment in Punjab, the influence of the Brahmo Samaj and Anjuman-I-Punjab, the proselyting activities of the Christian missionaries, the colonial stereotyping of the Sikh identity and their decline of official control of the Sikh holy places, and so on. Frustration with moderate politics was definitely the major reason behind the rise of extremist reaction. The Congress under moderate leadership was being governed by an undemocratic constitution. Although after repeated attempts by Tilak, a new constitution was drafted and ratified in 1899, it was never given a proper trial. The Congress was also financially broke, as the capitalists did not contribute and the patronage of few rajas and landed magnates was never sufficient. The social reformism of the moderates, inspired by Western liberalism, also went against popular orthodoxy. This came to the surface at the Pune Congress of 1895, and the moderators proposed to have a national social conference running in tandem with the regular sessions of the Congress. More orthodox leaders like Tilak argued that the social conference would split the Congress, and the proposal was ultimately dropped. But more significantly, moderate politics had reached a dead end as most of their demands remained unfulfilled, and this was certainly a major reason behind the rise of extremism. This increased the anger against colonial rule, and this anger was generated by the moderators themselves through the economic critique of colonialism. Indeed, at this stage, this was the central problematic. I'm lost. Indeed, at this stage, this was the central problematic of Indian nationalism. The moderators had wanted to Indian nation to develop through a modernistic course, but modernism being a Western concept, this meant an advocacy of the continuation of colonial rule. The extremists, on the other hand, sought to oppose colonial rule and therefore had to talk in terms of a non-Western paradigmism. They tried to define the Indian nation in terms of distinctly Indian cultural items, which led them to religious revivalism, invoking a glorious past, sometimes even unquestioned acceptance and glorification of that past. But their Hinduism was only a political construct, not defined by any definite religious attributes. As the 19th century Englishmen claimed ancient Greece as their classical heritage, the English-educated Indians also felt proud of the achievements of the Vedic civilization. This was essentially an imaginary history with a specific historical purpose of instilling a sense of pride in the minds of a selected group of Indians involved in the process of imagining their nation. Some of the leaders like Tilak or Aurobindo also believed that this use of Hindu mythology and history was the best means to reach the masses and mobilize them in support of their politics. The veteran moderate politicians refused to accommodate these new trends within the Congress policies and programs, and this led to the split in the Congress in Surat session in 1907. Muslims, politics and the foundation of the Muslim League. The mainstream Indian nationalism, which was growing under the haze of Indian National Congress and which, as we have seen previously failed to maintain its separation from the blooming Hindu nationalism, was first contested by the Muslims. However, in the late 19th century, the Muslims were by no means a homogeneous community with a discriminable political opinion in the whole of India, including the princely states. They constituted 90.7% of the population in 1881, but there were significant regional variation in their distribution. In the united provinces, the Muslims constituted a minority, being slightly more than 30% of the population. For in Punjab, on the other hand, they were a majority, accounting for slightly more than 51% of the population. In Bengal, the census of 1872 revealed to everybody's surprise that the Muslims represented nearly half of the population. Apart from such dissimilarities in demographic characteristics, there were also some other important differences in the position and composition of the Muslim community spread over the subcontinent, such as most significantly sectarian differences, linguistic barriers, and economic disparities. The colonial authorities, while defining the indigenous society for administrative management, ignored such demographic inequalities and diversity of status. So all the finer distinctions in regional philosophical orientation of South Asian Islam were ignored, and an image of a homogeneous religio-political community was conjured up. The evolution of a politicized Muslim communitarian identity in the late 19th century, it is true, was not entirely in response to initiatives from above, but we should nevertheless keep in mind the new institutionalized knowledge of social taxonomy that colonial rule offered, and the new public space it created in setting a context for such cultural construction, which could later be so easily connected to wider political projects. The major premise to colonial cognition of Indian society was the theme of differentiation, which was traced, mapped, and enumerated through various official ethnographic studies, and finally, since 1872, through decennial census reports. So far as the Bengal Muslims were concerned, as it has been shown in some recent studies, they were a highly fragmented group, vaguely united by a common allegiance to the essentials of the Islamic faith. There was considerable economic differences within the community, with a minority of large landed magnates at the top and a majority of a pure peasants at the bottom. This also coincided with the significant cultural differentiation between the Ashraf and the Azlaf sections within the community. The former were divided into two segments: the urban Urdu-speaking elites and the rural Urdu Bengali-speaking Phosphorus landlords. At the other end was the Bengali-speaking peasantry known as the Azlaf. Coming up to the more modern period, the Muslim community in Bengal, unlike the Hindus, clearly lacked a sizable educated professional intermediary group which could close the hiatus between the two sections of their populations in the newly instituted colonial public space. This was because of their backwardness position in educational status, both in absolute numbers as well as in relative terms vis-a-vis in the Hindus. The essentials of Muslim politics had taken up shape in Bengal even before the more well-known Sayyid Ahmad Khan's movement was started in UP. It soon took the form of modernization campaigns started around the middle of the 19th century. The Bengali Muslims had become closer to their North Indian co-religionists since 1899, when the annual Muhammadan Educational Conference was held at Calcutta, but the events of 1906 brought them even closer, though not entirely on cordial terms. In Eastern Bengal, the resignation of Lieutenant Governor Bamphled Fuller, known for his pro-partition, pro-Muslim sympathies, and the possibility of partition itself being resigned, made the Bengal Muslim leadership panicky, and then the Secretary of State Morley's budget speech of 1906 indicated that representative government was going to be introduced in India. The success of the deputation was a tremendous moral booster to Muslim politics, yet mere verbal assurance were hardly expected to satisfy the younger Muslims. They had long been feeling the need for separate political organizations for themselves. A religious orientation of the movement was also on their agenda, as there has now been, as well described it, as a clear shift of emphasis from Quran to Ummah community based on allegiance to a common faith. The 35 delegates at Simla therefore decided to organize the community for independent political action to secure for themselves a recognition from the government as a nation within a nation. To use the words of Aga Khan, the leader of the delegation, the next annual Muhammadan Educational Conference was scheduled to be held in December 1906 in Dhaka, the capital of the new province of Eastern Bengal and Assam. So it was decided that this opportunity would be taken to launch a new Muslim party. The situation in Dhaka was already volatile. The nationalist agitation against the partition of Bengal had gained an unexpected momentum, and there was widespread fear among the Bengali Muslims and that government might succumb to the nationalist pressure and the partition to the disadvantage of the Muslims. There was already a proposal from Nawab Salim Mullah of Dhaka, the leader of the East Bengali Muslims, about the formation of a political party for the Muslims, and this could be an excellent starting point for further discussion. So it was in this Dhaka Educational Conference on 13 December in 1906 that a new party was launched, and it was called the All Indian Muslim League. Its professed goals were to safeguard the political rights and interests of the Muslims, to preach loyalty to the British, and to further the cause of intercommunal amity. The Muslim supporters of the Congress immediately tried to counteract this move, but in vain. The majority of the educated Muslims had already decided to tread along a different path. Until about 1910, for all practical purposes, the India Muslim League maintained its existence only as an adjunct of the Muslim identity from minority status to nationhood, took along an tortuous trajectory, and in the meanwhile relationship between the League and the Indian National Congress remained on shaky grounds. Between 1920 and 24, they launched a joint agitation over the issue of Khilafat, but since then their ways progressively drifted apart. We will trace out that story further in the subsequent chapters.